So pack 2 is about looking at the first 20 minutes of a lesson and looking to pace that in such a way that you are setting your pupil with Down syndrome up to feel successful, to feel calm and regulated and ready to focus and engage. And that we found to be particularly important from the very start of the school year, particularly for Year 7s joining a school for the first time. But I suspect that this is going to be really important at all levels of junior and secondary for those pupils returning to school after a period of extended home learning. I think that the sensory challenges and the emotional challenges of being back in a busier environment might mean that we need to work a little bit harder at settling pupils at the beginning of a lesson. So think first about how they physically arrive in your room if that lesson follows a period of transition around the building. If they're moving from one room to another, that's going to take more time. Gross and fine motor challenges in children with Down syndrome mean packing away and moving through a school takes longer. Lots of pupils with Downs will have sensory challenges, which will mean that moving through busy corridors also present a whole other level of challenge, so that they can arrive late to a room having had a challenging time in sensory terms, feeling dysregulated. If they're then arriving to an already full class and quite often a lesson that's already started, then you're adding to that the sheer embarrassment of getting to a doorway and seeing all eyes turn to look at you. And too often that results in the people with Downs refusing. And that's so easy to just interpret as behaviour, resistant behaviour, when actually if you unpick the process of what they've just been through, it makes absolute sense. So we found it's far less disruptive for everybody for the pupil with Downs to start packing away 10 minutes before the end of a lesson, to be ready to physically leave a lesson 5 minutes before the end of a lesson, so that they can move through quiet corridors and arrive nice and early. That also means they're the first or among the first to greet or be greeted by the new teacher for the next lesson, and that's really important. That quiet moment at the start of a lesson in September, in the first half of the autumn term, you need to utilise as much as possible. Eye contact, greeting by name, a big smile can go an awful long way to start to forge a bond, a relationship between the pupil with Downs and their new subject teachers at secondary level. If you can add to that the business of giving them a little job, can you rely on them? Can you use them and trust them with a little job to really build their self-esteem, to really help them feel that they are valuable and entrusted? Because that's so important for getting everything right and ready to sit and listen and engage. So handing out books, wiping the whiteboard for you, opening the blinds, giving out a resource, whatever it might be, a simple little job. Set something aside, have something set aside ready at the beginning of every lesson. It might not be something that you need to sustain for the whole year. It might work really nicely and you might want to keep that going, but it makes a big difference at the beginning of the school year. Some schools have found it really useful to have a visual checklist in the classroom, pinned to the wall next to the pupil's desk, so that they can physically tick off the to-do list for the beginning of the lesson. There's some examples of that there. The other part of the first 5 minutes of a lesson is this business of supporting them to listen. It's incredibly difficult, it's a very passive exercise, and the best way to support the pupil with Downs to stay engaged and feel good and comfortable during that part of the lesson is to try and bring in something visual to enable it to feel a little bit more active. There are lots of examples on the slides of ways to hone in on the key vocab and to create simple little exercises in order to create that kind of more active engagement with the passive job of listening. So have a look at those. And then the rest of the slides in this pack look at some ideas for errorless starter tasks. So to look at activities which take what you've looked at in the supported listening, which is the key vocab for the lesson. It might be gas, liquid, solid, it might be Capulet and Montague, and to do a little bit of work around that, to play with that, and to start looking at how that looks in practice. So that could be a very simple labelling exercise, for instance, or sequencing or closed procedure. But to make it errorless, all that really means is to give them the finished version against which to match. But there's lots of ideas broken down on those slides as well for how you can break that through down a little bit more. I will say not to be frightened in starter tasks of repetition. Repetition is a good thing. It doesn't mean that you're letting yourself off the hook with planning by doing the same thing. If it works, use it and reuse it. One of the big challenges for pupils with Downs is to transfer their knowledge from short-term to long-term memory. And one of the ways to consolidate knowledge, a really effective way, is repetition. And so you'll see there, for instance, at the beginning of a unit, a labelling exercise where the pupil is given the same worksheet to label and is asked, do you remember when we labelled this before? Can you find it in your book? Right, use that to complete this. So it was a couple of minutes of literally copying, but it means that for that couple of minutes, they're independent, they're successful, and they are rehearsing that key vocab. It's exposing them, again, for a couple of minutes at the top of a lesson to the core vocabulary upon which the rest of the lesson is based. And so repetition isn't something to shy away from. Repetition, familiarity is really key. And the other aspect of familiarity is to use the toolkit resources to set new content up in familiar ways. And that's one of the philosophies behind a lot of the templates in the toolkit, is to give you the capacity to build people confidence with an activity, because I remember when we used this template before, I know what I'm doing here, so yes, I'm up for this, I'm up for it. And so all of those activities are broken down, but I'm hoping that in the photographs and the examples on the slides will give you an idea for new ways of looking at very familiar activities that you will be setting in the normal course of things, just shifting focus a little bit to come at those in a different way. Another one of the key messages underpinning some of these changes of approach is to go back to the idea that multitasking is really hard. So if you're wanting them, for instance, to take a list of terms or sentences and separate them out under two categories, for instance, with a categorization task, that if you're asking them to do that by writing, then the act of writing takes over. The act of writing that out absolutely takes over. If instead you ask them to chop those sentences up and physically move them around, you're freeing up an awful lot more working memory space for them to think, for them to read and process, for them to bring their knowledge and show you what they understand. So the act of writing should always be set as a follow-on task. When you're asking them to write, all you're really getting is an example of their handwriting. And that's valid across the curriculum, but use it as a follow-on task. Look to find physical ways for them to show you what they know, other alternative methods, and these slides have lots of those. And obviously, any further problems you can get in touch with your advisory teacher, but there are lots of examples here, and there's lots of examples as well on the toolkit resource too, for ways around that. So I'm hoping that will give you lots of ideas.